Perhaps I should begin by saying something about our centre in DCU, which we started a few years ago. We do some teaching. It could be regarded as teaching for global citizenship, and we're now involved with a number of other universities in developing that idea. But we're doing as well what the university calls engaged research, and we're very lucky that our partner in this is the Irish Council of Churches, and the Catholic Church has joined in this under the wider heading of the Irish Interchurch Meeting, and we've also reached out to other faith communities. So we're doing this engaged research on a number of very challenging issues such as the future of Europe and the economy post-COVID. And I'm happy to engage on that later on if anyone is interested. But I'll turn now to my prepared remarks about hope, which I've entitled Towards a Civilization of Hope. In his new book, The Power of Reconciliation, Archbishop Justin Welby focuses on the moral imagination. His thesis, if I understand it correctly, is that we can cultivate the moral imagination as a common good in the service of truth. Last year, with 3 friends, I published a book on the global future, on the significance of religion for global diplomacy. It's this small book, and this book can be seen as an exercise in nurturing the moral imagination as a common good. Thanks very much. In particular, we focus on the development of our historical imagination. We start from current realities: pandemic, climate change and environmental degradation, the impact of digital technologies, widening social disparities, and of course conflict. The future is invisible, indeterminate and full of risk. It often seems that history is accelerating. What is to be done? Is there a guiding principle? How does change happen? Is there a next step? My talk this evening falls into 2 parts and will lead, I hope, to some dialogue and interaction. First, I will explore the meaning of hope, drawing on Pope Benedict's encyclical Spe Salvi, especially the statement that, quote, all serious and upright conduct is hope in action. And second, I will briefly outline the thesis of our book. We argue that a better methodology and clearer orientation can prepare the way for addressing particular problems. We must find the courage to believe, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer believed during the darkest days of the 20th century, that something new can be born that is not discernible in the alternatives of the present. I'm very struck with an example that I read of how we can understand this, of something that's not discernible in the present. You ask the question, was it possible in medieval Baghdad for people to fly aeroplanes? Now, the first obvious answer is no, it wasn't possible. But the second answer has to be yes, it was possible because it actually happened. But what happened was that a number of intermediate steps were taken which made possible what was theoretically not possible at the time. So we are trying to apply this idea to politics, and we say that through developing a culture of dialogue or encounter in national, regional and global politics, we can transform our understanding of effective action and create the conditions for a different kind of civilization. Again, this has happened. If you take the question of the role of women in society, there has been an enormous civilizational change in the 20th century, which is now beginning to impact on peace building and in many other ways. And in different periods of history, we've seen remarkable improvements in the context for politics. You know, one could take examples from the world of the Hebrew prophets, or Confucius, or the Buddha or whatever, but there are so many examples of how a civilization can actually develop. So the first part of my presentation begins from this powerful statement of Pope Benedict that all serious and upright conduct is hope in action. I noticed three very striking ideas in Spe Salvi. Not so much ideas, perhaps, as meditations, interconnected meditations. The first arises from the sequencing of Benedict's three principal encyclicals, Deus Caritas Est, Spe Salvi, and Caritas in Veritate. To come to believe in God's love, the theme of Deus Caritas Est, leads on to faith and hope. In Spe Salvi, faith and hope are almost indistinguishable. At one point, faith-hope appears as a hyphenated word. Love and faith-hope taken together have an operative power or outward-looking character which leads to action in the world, as described in Caritas in Veritate. I would suggest that Pope Benedict has reshaped the triad faith, hope, and charity as love, hope, and action. This new triad implies relationship, movement, and change. It places action in hope at the center of our lives. A similar emphasis is implicit in the title Caritas in Veritate. Caritas comes first. In following our hearts, we discover the truth of situations. The second meditation that I find in Pope Benedict concerns the inner nature of hope. Earlier theologians analyze hope as the mean between presumption and despair. Hope is then a virtue, the virtue of man or woman as pilgrim. Spe Salvi offers a different perspective. Concrete examples of human suffering are interwoven in the narrative from the worlds of ancient slavery and modern concentration camps. The focus has switched from inner equilibrium to outer reality. For Pope Benedict, the main point about hope is that it represents, quote, the impossibility that the injustice of history should be the final word, unquote. Here is Václav Havel on hope. A state of mind, not a state of the world. An orientation of the spirit, of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. That something makes sense regardless of how it turns out, and the impossibility that the injustice of history should be the final word are dynamic assertions. They imply a readiness to act, even in the face of steep odds. An important part of this second meditation on hope, hope as a sign of contradiction and a source of energy in concrete situations, is the use that Pope Benedict makes of the letter to the Hebrews. For Aristotle, a virtue is a disposition that can be developed by repeated actions having a certain character. I think I'm right that habitus is the word St. Thomas would use to describe such a disposition or virtue. The letter to the Hebrews takes a different approach, using two striking images to capture the mystery of faith-hope. The first of these images is substance, an image drawn from the sphere of economics. The second is argument or proof, an image drawn from the sphere of law. In other words, faith-hope is not primarily a virtue or acquired disposition, nor is it primarily a subjective conviction. It is more like an inner resource that is in part gift. The perception that the deepest truth about reality is always in some way given is not unique to the Judeo-Christian tradition. In his Theogony, one of the first works of Western literature, Hesiod claims a relationship with a source of truth that is both personal and of divine origin, namely the Muses encountered in the mists of Mount Helicon. Without this initial encounter, which is entirely given, Hesiod would be just another hungry shepherd, which is a quotation. And of course Moses was a shepherd, David was a shepherd, and Amos was a shepherd. I think there's something about shepherds, and also the shepherds appear in the Gospel of St. Luke, but I'm not really going to go down that road at the moment. So here I enter a caveat. To say that hope is given does not mean that it is detached from reason. In the Hebrew prophets, genuine hope comes with an ethical dimension and a certain kind of realism. Jeremiah opposes the wishful thinking, false optimism, and empty hope of his rival Hananiah. A crucial aspect of the prophetic tradition is that hope can go against the current of events and yet remain reasonable. The object of our love or hope is never a matter of indifference. When divorced from good intentions and good judgment, hope becomes morally dangerous. I would like to emphasize this point that hope goes against the current. Greek philosophers associate the virtues of hope and courage. In political decision-making, we are drawn towards one or other of two standards, the self-interested option or the more generous option. Very often they present as a short-term advantage or an investment in a less certain long-term hope. The second option then is the option of hope, and compared to the first option, it often requires exceptional courage, especially the moral courage of embarking on a journey towards an unknown destination or a journey that will only be completed by others after our time. The American author Jonathan Lear studies the response of indigenous peoples in America to the disappearance of all the main coordinates of their lives. The point is they continue to hope. This is a quotation from Lear's work. Radical hope anticipates a good for which those who have the hope as yet lack the appropriate concepts with which to understand it. I can't help suggesting also that the whole story of Virgil's Aeneid, the journey of Aeneas from the ruins of Troy across the Mediterranean after several false starts to Italy, to start a new political initiative bringing together Latins, Etruscans, Greeks, Trojans, which will only bear fruit many, many generations later. That is a whole textbook illustration of long-term hope. I turn now to our third meditation, which I think is the most important for those who are actually working in the field for justice. In Spe Salvi we find the following beautiful and profound statement about human agency. We can uncover the sources of creation and keep them unsullied. In the first letter to the Corinthians, we are described as co-workers of God. We are the farmers and construction workers in a project which has an overall design and logic. From this, a number of things follow. First, our actions have an intrinsic or objective value. They are true in themselves. Second, if we are co-workers of God, we do not need to determine the ultimate significance of each action. We are not and do not need to be fully masters of cause and effect. And third, it follows from this that there's a convergence between action, suffering, and prayer. Appraising the truth of a situation, which requires discernment, and acting or suffering in consequence of this are bound up together and depend on the inner movement that we call prayer. My fourth and main observation on uncovering the sources of creation is that we can tell from experience that actions that conform with hope will be in harmony with other similar actions, including other people's actions, even if there's no direct connection. Our enabling role in uncovering the sources of creation implies the consistency, compatibility, and coherence of good actions. Hope provides a common criterion of measurement from one situation to another. The National Peace and Justice Network is living proof that individual interventions in the name of justice and mercy reinforce one another and can support wider social objectives as well. This is not just about shaping coalitions. That can happen, certainly, but the point is deeper. A common criterion of evaluation, let us call it the standard of hope, links one situation to another and enables us to give the future a certain shape or character even before the detailed picture becomes clear. In the 21st century, planetary ecology and the need for a just transition depend on numerous individual decisions linked together by a common criterion of evaluation. This common criterion cannot be the standard of self-interest, which pushes us in different directions. Any common criterion of evaluation at the global level will resemble our standard of hope. Hope, if restored to its full meaning in our culture, can inspire and bring together all those who face the future determined to be part of the solution, all those willing to serve under the banner of justice to bring consolation and healing to an ailing society. I turn now to my second theme, which concerns the nature of politics. The state of global politics, conflicts, the pandemic, climate change, invites us to rethink the economy and the nature of international security, an epochal challenge. In our book, as I mentioned, we argue for intermediate steps in the realm of methodology and orientation. This can be the prelude to concrete negotiations on particular issues in particular frameworks. Before and during World War II, a number of British writers and thinkers, including J.H. Oldham of the Church of Scotland, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, began exploring the concept of middle axioms as a possible bridge between theology and politics. In Germany, at roughly the same time, the Kreisau Circle explored new approaches to economics, politics, and European cooperation for implementation after the war. Good examples of middle axioms or unifying principles, as developed by these thinkers, would be the need for social solidarity and for European cooperation. The welfare state, through Beveridge, today's European Union, and even the ecumenical movement owe a great deal to the philosophical groundwork undertaken during the war. The concept of middle axioms is the initial spark that led to the approach we take in our book. Our recommendations in the book can be summarized as follows. We can develop axioms of the historical imagination, a 21st century version of middle axioms, to provide a common criterion of evaluation across cultures and from one situation to another. Acting in the light of common axioms creates community even among people and groups who never interact directly. Second, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, already constitute in embryo a medium-term common plan for humanity. So our recommendation is that international organizations should use their convening power to bring about new multi-layered consultative processes inclusive of the representatives of religion to underpin the implementation of the SDGs and complement the day-to-day negotiations that currently take place in a range of settings. So we're not suggesting that all these day-to-day negotiations should stop, but we're suggesting that governments and foreign ministries and people involved in policy planning should open up a different track with a long-term horizon into which they would bring other actors. Our third idea is that these new consultative processes will require a new style of negotiating mandate aimed at a distinctive diplomatic product or outcome. This product will be a combination of, first, the gradual definition of new criteria or points of agreement to govern the conduct of international relations, and second, confidence-building measures, CBMs as they're sometimes called, with demonstration value in the perspective of a future age of sharing at the global level. I'd be happy to say more about this concept of demonstration value later. I've actually learned it from DFID, where it was being applied in a setting where I worked for a period. Our final and fourth point is that our axioms point towards an anthropological development over the coming decades. I referred to this already. A global humanism founded on a broad understanding of the scope of reason. This is also a Pope Benedict point, that we've been trained to think of reason as operating in the realm either of the laboratory or of logic, whereas in fact there is a tremendous truth value in literature, there's a truth value in political decisions and so on, so that reason operates differently to how we sometimes think in a Western secular context. Just as freedom, the word freedom, has a different meaning, I think, in the light of faith than it has in a market system where it's sometimes thought to mean just choice. So we're arguing that a global humanism founded on a broad understanding of the scope of reason and a deeper understanding of freedom is within reach, and that steps we take now, human agency, can open a pathway to positive political changes that are not yet visible. In our book, we examine, against this background, criteria for the effective interaction of policymakers with religious actors. The major occupational hazard of politics is losing touch with essential values that cannot be constituted by the process of politics itself. You can't legislate for trust. We always need a standpoint from which to critique the status quo. So there's always a dialogical relationship, it could be said, between our higher level values, which are not created by law, and the granular provisions of the law. At the same time, churches and faith communities can become more themselves through the dialogue with public authorities and other actors. They, or we, I should say, can start new discussions and develop new forms of leadership. In other words, the approach we take in our book can help both politics and theology. In the sphere of politics, we know that freedom of religion or belief is a core human right. Religious literacy, quote unquote, is widely acknowledged as a necessary diplomatic skill, for example, in conflict situations in the Middle East. We argue for something more than this. We take freedom of belief and religious literacy for granted. But our thesis is that in the interests of the global common good, politics and diplomacy need to return to the roots of our culture and access a deeper level of thought that remains true to the best instincts of ordinary people. And one way of doing this is for public authorities to engage with religious and philosophical perspectives. For the theological implications of this approach, I turn to Pope Benedict again. Benedict argues in Spe Salvi that the Church must go beyond herself. She must not allow herself to be understood simply as an institution satisfying the personal needs of some. She must engage with Western secular rationality and the religious traditions of India and elsewhere, and play an active part in helping to shape the future. Writing when he was still a cardinal, Pope Benedict put this very bluntly. One might go so far as to say the Church will survive only if she is in a position to help mankind overcome this hour of trial. I realise as I go on that I've quoted Pope Benedict many times and not Pope Francis. That's not any kind of deliberate point that I'm making. I would argue very much that Pope Benedict, in ways that we don't fully appreciate, has laid the foundations for what Pope Francis is doing. That's a whole other discourse one could have, but I think Pope Francis is drawing on Pope Benedict, who is secretly more radical than we think in the political area. I'm coming towards a conclusion, but first I will briefly set out our 6 axioms. There's no time, and I don't think it would be helpful for me to go on about them, because in a talk like this you can't really say everything. But I will just read the axioms before I conclude. We put a lot of thought into them, and they're intended to be axioms that would be acceptable to Christians or other religious believers, or people who come to the public sphere with a life stance or a world view, but who perhaps don't want to identify as persons of faith. So these are the 6 axioms. The first is about conscience. We should examine the patterns of our behaviour in the light of all that we ought to know and can know. That's a very demanding standard, because all that we ought to know and can know imposes an obligation on us to actually look into some of those situations around us that we tend not to think about. It also requires us to turn to disciplines and lines of scholarship that we may not have considered particularly relevant at first glance. The second axiom is that we should image or visualize peace as the rightful possession of the human community as a whole. That may sound obvious, but we sometimes seem to be moving towards a world in which we find it impossible to visualize peace as the rightful possession of the human family. We seem to think that we're heading towards some kind of apocalyptic clash of civilizations, for example. Our third axiom is about how change happens. So we say we should identify and explore the factors that accompany healing in a wounded social structure. This is partly about the politics of the next step. If you've been involved, as I had the privilege of being in the Northern Ireland peace process, you can see many examples of what I mean. Healing is not something that's particularly easy to bring about. Our fourth axiom is that we should recognize that the starting position for political deliberation is inevitably non-ideal. This is, again, so obvious when you think about it, but sometimes we act as though we're on top of the world somehow, and we have everything right, and there's just some alien element which is creeping into the situation, which would otherwise be perfectly all right. In fact, we always are in a deficit. We're always living within a defective situation with a heavy legacy of the past hanging over us. Our fifth axiom is about discernment, and this draws on Pope Francis a lot, and he has a lot about discernment in Let Us Dream. We say that discernment in the midst of opacity, in accordance with a common standard, should become a core value in the conduct of international relations. Of course, I'm also thinking here, we were thinking, two of the 4 authors were at Jesuit schools, so we were thinking about what we learned at school about St. Ignatius and the 2 standards. But also, Pope Francis has very interesting things to say about this, that if you're lost, this is how I understand him at any rate, if you're lost in a political situation, try to formulate alternatives. And once you have the alternatives and meditate on them, you may find a way forward which is different to either A or B. It might be C, but the effort of formulating option A and option B is what enables option C to emerge. And then our sixth and last option, or axiom, is that we should give expression to a changing diplomatic culture through new frameworks of engagement. Now, we have a lot to say of a very concrete nature about that. Those of us who've spent many decades in multilateral negotiations can point to processes that were badly conceived from the beginning, that were stuck from the beginning, and then you can also point to processes that actually achieved something. And you can ask then, what were the conditions that enabled some conferences to work, such as the Law of the Sea Conference or the original Helsinki process, which led to the Helsinki Final Act, and so on. So the question of frameworks of engagement is a little art form in itself. And especially, it seems to me, you need time, because unless you have time, you don't have personal relationships among those who represent the different interests. So you need to have a meeting which could last for a long time, and then a break, and then you have to come together again. You have to have enough time so that any proposal can be put on the table. There can then be a sifting process where some proposals fail to make headway and others seem to be attracting more interest. But without time, then it seems to me you're almost inevitably going to end up with something very like the clash of physical systems rather than the encounter of people or persons. So I'm going to conclude now by saying that our central thesis in this book is that new forms of historical literacy allied to new frameworks of engagement can enable a more creative politics and diplomacy. The orientation and methodology that we promote through our 6 axioms aim to achieve a balance between the interweaving of different countries' interests, an interweaving which is tangible and ongoing, and the interaction of consciences, which seems to take place only at the margins of international politics. So we need new methods, better thought out agendas, and longer time frames if politics and diplomacy are to catch up with current trends. Rather than say more, I would prefer at this point to invite questions and comments. Maybe with Tim's help we could have some kind of discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Philip. I don't think I was